This program is brought to you by Bobway Media, a work of the Chipman Road Church of Christ in Lee's Summit, Missouri, and under the oversight of the elders of the Chipman Road Church of Christ. We thank you for listening.
It's interesting that we really don't know anything about that much about his life until he, suddenly appears on the scene as one of the most important prophets of God. I mean, when we read about the judge and priest Samuel, or, maybe even the other judges, or Esther or Ruth, we kind of know all about where they came from. I mean, maybe their parents, or about their parents, or maybe the death of them, but not him. We're introduced to him in what seems to me to be kind of the middle of the story. He just appears. He's a mighty man of God who comes out of nowhere to battle a nation on his own, no help, no army like Gideon, no dry bones come to life in this story, not even a pot or a trumpet, nothing. That's just a man who has no book named after him. There's no Elijah chapter whatever. It's just an account of a man, an account of a life woven into just 8 chapters. 1 Kings chapter 17 through 2 Kings chapter 2. It's just of a guy who interfered into the lives of others. He was just a regular guy. Really, I mean, nothing extraordinary about him except, well, he just kept doing everything right, even though God knew it was just too much for him. Yeah, that's not something we think about, is it, when we think about Elijah? The man who we're introduced to in 1 Kings chapter 17, who, steps into the picture during a severe drought God had brought on his people because of their corruption, their worship of Baal. And this was kind of like their final straw, and God brings in Elijah. That's all we know at that point, until, of course, the magnificent display on Mount Carmel between he and the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 17, when he built that altar of 12 stones, and he soaked the altar and the oxen with water, and he called God to bring fire from heaven that consumed the altar and everything there, even the stones. And then he goes forward and kills 450 prophets of Baal, all in a single night. That was impressive. Until it, wasn't any longer. The aftermath of Jezebel. It was just a guy, a servant of God, a regular man dealing with the reality of what he had done. 1 Kings chapter 19. When Ahab told Jezebel what happened, and Jezebel vows to kill Elijah, that's when we meet, or I guess I should say really meet, the man, Elijah, who walked a day into the wilderness on his own and sat down under a juniper tree to die. And that's where God fed him and gave him water and let him rest. And an angel of the Lord brought him that food, and he ate. And then he got up and he went to Horeb, the mountain of God, and he found a cave. And you know the rest. I mean, it's a pretty famous story. Elijah goes into the cave. He doesn't want to come out. He's depressed. He's dejected. And he's feeling utterly alone in the world. Although he won. He won, and he did it. He was impressive. He was courageous. He still feels defeated. And honestly, it isn't usually the way that God's servants feel for just doing the right thing. Remember, David was crowned king. I mean, after he had run from Saul for years and years. And even though he sinned, and he was confronted with his sin and he admitted it, David got up off the floor on his own, 2 Samuel chapter 12, and God gave them another son, a son that he loved. And Esther went into the throne room after all that pressure, and then all went well, and Mordecai ends up being the hero. And remember, Ruth, she walked all that way with her mother-in-law, and at the end of that journey, she meets this wonderful man. She marries and has a baby who becomes the grandfather of King David. And Gideon, even Gideon was victorious. And here Elijah was, after all that he did, alone, even though he did everything right. What he did was right. but it still didn't feel right to him. Life felt just like it was a little too much. And that may be maybe the same for me or for you, for us. When I have to remind myself that this isn't that bad, that it could be much worse, that this isn't the most important thing. When life is crushing me down and when everything was just fine just a minute ago, and now I'm looking at the entire situation in pieces at my feet. That's when I have to remind myself there are others out there trying to do the right thing too. I just can't see them. And when I'm so weary and doubt that I can stay afloat and I keep paddling when the shoreline disappears, and that's when I have to remember and remind myself there's something else more important. And when my emotions overwhelm me and darkness surrounds me, when we can't catch our breath because it has all been knocked out of us, that's when we have to think about someone else, something else, and see that the darkness isn't so dark. And there is light out there. We just can't see it at the moment, but it's there. And it seems that it hits me the most, the lowest of the lows, when I've had the highest of the highs, and I'm breathing freely and comfortable. That's when the blow comes, and I find myself on the floor face down, wondering where I am and what I'm doing. How did we get here from way up there so quickly? That's when we have to try to find our compass, our bearings. Look for some point on the horizon that we can focus on and get our bearings back and think and make ourselves think and remember and convince ourselves it will get better. And maybe that's why I remind myself of Elijah so much. He wasn't perfect. He was totally alone. He felt alone. And he gets hungry and he does what God says, but that doesn't mean it works out perfectly. And sometimes life is hard, even when you're trying your best. And this account of Elijah tells me that God knows that too, because God fed Elijah. And God gives Elijah water. And he even tells Elijah, you need to rest, because God says, the journey is too great for you. Verse 7 of chapter 19 of 1 Kings. And God then spends time with Elijah, and he listens to his heart, and then he gives Elijah the reminder that he needs. That even though it may seem that way, life isn't as bad as it seems. God knows, and he cares. And Elijah isn't alone, ever. Yeah, we don't know that much about his life before he shows up to confront Ahab. It's as if, I don't know, he appears out of nowhere, but he's so courageous and he's so confident and seems so fearless. But God doesn't stop Elijah's story there. He lets us see the afterward. He lets us see Elijah's doubt and his fear and hear his worries, his sadness, his depression, his loneliness, his humanness. And that tells me that God sees us too. He understands and knows that there are times when things in this life seem too heavy to carry. There are peaks and then there are valleys. There are glimpses of the kinds in that shows that there are glimpses of the kind of relationships that we can have. A relationship that we should have with our Savior, who knows what it's like to walk this earth and to deal with the challenges that we deal with, knows what it's like to be alone, to be abandoned. A Savior who, when he was at his most vulnerable, when he was at his most weary, when the task ahead was so hard, our Savior walked to a mountain and chose to speak with Moses and Elijah, Matthew chapter 17. God's servants who strengthened him to do what he needed to do, because it would be too much for you and it would be too much for me. And it is for this that I bow my knees with you today to a Father who sees, a God who cares and gives us what we need when we are weary and reminds us that we are not alone. even when life seems to be too much for us.
We hope you have enjoyed today's program. You can find out more about Bob Wade Media by visiting our website at bobwademedia.org, as well as finding us on social media. And as always, to God be the glory.